For 5 years on television, they were an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object. The kind-hearted, naive country boy and the perpetually furious drill sergeant who could never, ever break him. Gomer Pyle and Sergeant Vince Carter. Their on-screen chemistry was legendary and it defined a classic sitcom. But what if all that tension wasn't just an act? For decades, rumors have swirled about on-set drama and a clash of personalities so intense it could rival any of their scripted shouting matches. And for just as long, the man at the center of it all, the brilliant Frank Sutton, kept his side of the story to himself, but the truth has a way of coming out. Thanks to a series of rare interviews and accounts from those who knew him best, the real story can finally be told. What was the source of the tension on the set of one of America's most beloved shows? Well, Frank Sutton did break his silence, just not in the way anyone expected. And the story that emerges is far more complex and human than any Hollywood gossip column could ever capture. This is the story of the incredible pressure that forged a TV icon, and the quiet burdens he carried long after the cameras stopped rolling. To understand the whispers of tension, you first have to understand just how huge this show was. When Gomer Pyle, U.S.M.C. debuted on September 25, 1964, it was a complicated time in America, and people were looking for an escape. They found it in the unlikeliest of places, a Marine Corps training camp. The show was a spin-off of The Andy Griffith Show, taking the gentle gas station attendant Gomer Pyle, played by Jim Nabors, and dropping him into the most rigid environment imaginable. The result was television gold. The show was an instant, massive hit, landing at number 3 in the ratings in its very first season. Over its 5-season run, it never once fell out of the top 10. At its peak, it was the second most-watched show in the country. It was pure comfort food for a weary nation, a show that famously and deliberately avoided any mention of the escalating Vietnam War. It created an escapist version of military life where the biggest conflict was whether Gomer would finally push his drill instructor completely over the edge, and at the heart of it all was Frank Sutton's masterful performance as gunnery Sergeant Vince Carter. With his bug-eyed glares and a voice that could strip paint, Sergeant Carter was a walking pressure cooker and a perfect foil for Gomer's innocence. Their dynamic was a masterclass in chemistry. Audiences couldn't get enough of the friction between them, it was the engine of the whole show. Over 150 episodes, you could see Carter, the ultimate tough guy, slowly reveal a begrudging, almost fatherly affection for the private who drove him nuts. It was this relationship that Sutton himself said made the show so popular. But behind all the laughter and the incredible ratings, a different story started to take shape, a story that suggested the on-screen tension wasn't always just for the cameras. For decades, the idea of a feud between Frank Sutton and Jim Nabors has been a persistent piece of classic TV lore. It's a juicy story, and an easy one to believe. I mean, how could two actors create that much animosity 5 days a week without some of it being real? The sheer intensity of Sutton's performance was all the fuel the rumor mill needed. His Sergeant Carter was so convincing that people began to wonder if it was more than just a script. Was that rage real? Was the frustration genuine? The rumors weren't loud or scandalous, no tabloid headlines or public fights. It was more of a slow burn, whispers from unnamed crew members about an iciness between takes. The story went that Sutton, the consummate professional, grew frustrated with Nabors' more laid-back approach. As the show's star, Jim Nabors' singing career was also taking off, leading to albums and concert tours. The whispers suggested that Sutton, a man who prided himself on discipline, felt the show was being compromised by a lead actor whose attention was divided. They were painted as two men on completely different wavelengths. Sutton was the serious, classically trained actor from Columbia University. Nabors was the nightclub singer discovered by Andy Griffith, a natural talent with a more relaxed style. The rumor was that by the later seasons, they barely spoke off camera, keeping things professional, but cold. Crew members would supposedly talk about tense silences on set, of a quiet frustration coming from Sutton whenever things didn't meet his standards, and what fueled all of this? Frank Sutton's defining characteristic off-screen, his privacy. Sutton was a notoriously private man. In an era where celebrities were getting more and more personal, he was a throwback. He refused to discuss his personal life, especially politics. When one interviewer in 1968 tried to ask him about his political views, Sutton shut it down, saying, "Wait a minute. This interview is taking a bad slant. I'm no more an authority on these things than the elevator man. I'm an actor." This wasn't arrogance, it was professionalism. He believed his job was to act, not be a personality. But in Hollywood, silence can look like a confession. His refusal to engage with the rumors allowed them to grow into accepted fact for many. For years, the story remained the same. Frank Sutton, a brilliant but difficult actor, secretly resented his co-star. When he passed away suddenly in 1974 at the tragically young age of 50, he had never publicly addressed the rumors. For decades, that seemed to be the final word. But it wasn't the truth. The truth, as it turns out, is much more interesting. The real story of the pressure Frank Sutton was under wasn't hidden in some angry memo. It was right there in plain sight, in the careful way he spoke about his craft in the rare interviews he actually gave. It was in the memories of his friends and family. When you piece it all together, you don't find a bitter feud. You find a dedicated, serious artist grappling with a very different kind of tension. The first clue comes from Sutton's own words about Sergeant Carter. He didn't see the character as a monster. In fact, he saw the opposite. In one interview, Sutton offered a shocking take on his on-screen persona. "I created the character," he said. "He's really very gentle." Gentle, that's probably the last word anyone would use to describe the screaming sergeant. Sutton explained that as the show went on, he was the one who pushed to soften Carter's personality and let his warmth come through. He admitted that while he might yell at his own kids, he was, in his own words, too soft to spank them. This wasn't a man channeling his own rage. This was a craftsman building a character that was, in many ways, the opposite of his own nature. The second piece of the puzzle is his deep respect for the military. Frank Sutton was a decorated World War II veteran. But again, the reality is more nuanced than the myth. The man who would become TV's most famous Marine was initially rejected by the Marine Corps for being colorblind. So, he enlisted in the U.S. Army instead. He served as a sergeant and participated in numerous assault landings during some of the fiercest fighting in the Pacific Theater. His service was intense and harrowing, and yet, he rarely spoke of it. When he did, it was with quiet humility. "Although I was never a Marine, I have great admiration for them," he said in a 1966 interview. "It's a trite saying that the Marine Corps makes a man out of you, but I have seen them do it in a lot of ways." The pressure he felt wasn't about a co-star, it was about honoring the real men who wore the uniform. And then there's the final, crucial discovery, pieced together from interviews he gave near the end of the show's run. You can feel a profound frustration in his words, but it was never aimed at Jim Nabors. It was aimed at the industry and the nature of fame itself. In a 1969 interview, Sutton reflected on his career before Gomer Pyle. "Until 5 years ago, the closest I came to comedy was being strapped into an electric chair as a convicted killer or being shot by the FBI," he said. "You might say now I am a killer turned comedian." He talked about the irony of comedians wanting to be seen as dramatic actors, while he, a dramatic actor, found fame in comedy. "Some of my roles were so vicious during the early part of my career," he recalled, "I'd have people hiss at me if they happened to recognize me on the street." These aren't the words of a man angry at his coworker. They are the words of a man grappling with the gilded cage of being typecast. He was grateful for Sergeant Carter, but he also felt trapped. "I know if it wasn't for the success I've had with Sergeant Carter, I wouldn't be getting offers of any kind, and I'm grateful," he said. "But as a character actor I've got to show that I have range. I'm not starving, so I'm going to sweat it out." This is the real story. The silence Frank Sutton finally broke wasn't about some petty on-set squabble. It was about a deep, internal conflict, a conflict not between two actors, but between a man and his own public image. The pressure he felt was real, but it had nothing to do with Jim Nabors. It was the pressure of art versus commerce, and a serious actor's struggle to be seen as more than just one shouting character. So, what was the real tension on the set of Gomer Pyle? It wasn't one big thing. It was a battle fought within Frank Sutton himself, on 3 separate fronts. The biggest source of pressure was the creative challenge of being Sergeant Vince Carter day after day. Carter wasn't an extension of Sutton's personality, he was an exhausting creation. Colleagues described Sutton as a quiet, thoughtful, and intellectual man. He graduated with honors from Columbia University with a degree in drama. Before Gomer Pyle, he had built a career in serious stage productions and gritty TV dramas, appearing in the Oscar-winning film Marty and shows like The Untouchables and The Twilight Zone. He was a serious dramatic actor at his core. Then came Sergeant Carter, a role that required him to exist at a constant level of cartoonish fury. The physical and emotional energy it took to generate that rage, take after take, was enormous. But the greater tension was the internal one, the tension of a nuanced, intelligent man playing a two-dimensional volcano. He poured all of his talent into giving Carter depth, into finding the gentle soul he believed was underneath the bluster. As the series went on, you can see Sutton's influence as Carter evolves from a simple antagonist into an almost fatherly figure to Gomer. The frustration you saw on screen was real in a sense. It was the channeled frustration of a serious craftsman being asked to paint with a very limited palette. The second great pressure was the weight of responsibility. Frank Sutton wasn't just an actor playing a soldier, he was a combat veteran playing a soldier. His service in the U.S. Army during World War II was a defining experience. He had seen the reality of military life up close in the Pacific, and that created a constant pressure to get it right. Even in a sitcom, he felt a duty to portray the uniform with respect. He researched the role of a Marine sergeant meticulously, stating, "There is absolutely no difference to me in preparing for a comedy Marine show or if I was playing a dead serious Marine role. You do all the method stuff." This dedication must have created a constant internal conflict. The show was, by design, escapist and unrealistic. For a man who had seen the real horrors of war, that must have been a strange line to walk. He reportedly hated violence, telling one publication he wouldn't even let his son play with a toy Tommy gun. Yet his fame was tied to a character who was the embodiment of military authority. His commitment went beyond the set, too. He participated in Marine Corps recruiting tours and visited troops in Vietnam in 1966, on his own dime. The pressure wasn't a conflict with a co-star, it was a conflict of conscience, a veteran's struggle to honor his past while succeeding in his present. The third, and perhaps most heartbreaking, pressure was the professional one. Sergeant Carter made Frank Sutton a star, but it also threatened to end his career as a versatile actor. The public and the industry could no longer see Frank Sutton, they could only see Sergeant Carter. This was a huge source of frustration for a man with his training and ambition. He had been a character actor who prided himself on his range, and now he was one of the most famous faces in America, inextricably linked to a single, shouting character. He was grateful for the fame, but he openly worried about his future. He knew that to have a career after Gomer Pyle, he had to prove he could do more. After the show ended in 1969, he joined Jim Nabors on his variety show, The Jim Nabors Hour, once again playing a comedic foil. That fact alone is pretty strong evidence that there was no deep-seated hatred between the two men. But it also shows how tightly he was bound to the persona. He found most of his later work in dinner theater, often in comedies, a world away from the serious drama he loved. This was the great, unspoken tension of Frank Sutton's life. He wasn't fighting with Jim Nabors, he was fighting for his own artistic soul. When you understand these internal pressures, you have to look at Sergeant Carter differently. It's no longer just a great comedic performance, it's a work of hidden depth. The rumors of a feud suddenly seem insignificant compared to the real struggles the actor was navigating every day. How does this change the way we see the character? When we watch the show now, we can see his performance through a new lens. Every time his face turns red as he launches into a tirade against Pyle, we're not just seeing a drill instructor at the end of his rope. We're seeing a classically trained actor pushing a broadly written character to its absolute limit to find a kernel of truth. When Sergeant Carter's eyes soften for just a moment, and a flicker of affection for Gomer breaks through, it's no longer just a good character beat. It is Frank Sutton, the artist, winning a small battle, injecting the humanity he believed was at the character's core. His real-life military experience adds another layer. We now understand his crisp salute not just as caricature, but as a reflection of a man who held the military in the highest regard, balancing entertainment with honor. He's no longer a two-dimensional foil. He's the canvas on which a brilliant and complex artist painted his masterpiece. The real tension wasn't in the barracks. It was in the heart and mind of Frank Sutton. Frank Sutton died of a heart attack on June 28, 1974. He was backstage at a dinner theater in Shreveport, Louisiana, getting ready to go on stage. He died doing what he loved. He was only 50 years old. His death was a shock, but the legacy he left is far richer than just one character. On the surface, his legacy is Sergeant Vince Carter. It's an immortal TV character. Reruns have ensured that generations know his face. The United States Marine Corps even made him an honorary sergeant. In his hometown of Clarksville, Tennessee, there's a life-sized bronze statue of him, not as Frank Sutton, but as Sergeant Carter. But there's a deeper legacy. It's the legacy of a consummate professional and a private man who was a devoted husband and father. It's the legacy of a patriot, a decorated combat veteran who never bragged about his service, but instead used his platform to respectfully honor the military. His enduring friendship with Jim Nabors, who he continued to work with after Gomer Pyle, quietly refutes decades of rumors. And finally, there is his legacy as an artist. He wrestled with the constraints of being typecast, a struggle so many actors face. Yet, he never let his frustrations turn into public bitterness. He kept working, kept honing his craft. His famous silence on the rumors wasn't about hiding a feud. It was the quiet dignity of a professional who let his work speak for itself. The ultimate truth is that Frank Sutton didn't need to break his silence on a fight that never happened. The story he actually told, through his life and his work, was one of dedication, professionalism, and the quiet struggle of an artist. That is the tension, and that is the triumph, of his legacy. Does learning about the real pressures Frank Sutton faced change how you see his iconic performance as Sergeant Carter? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And for more untold stories of classic television, be sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what we uncover next.